See so many people here, particularly young people, ready to be engaged with this evening's lecture. As many of you know, we reprised the Newman lecture series 3 years ago as a chance for us to bring in different speakers from different fields of education and learning to talk about how their field, whether it be philosophy or literature or science, engages with the faith. And so we're very, very excited to have today Dr. Edward Feser. Now, I'll be very honest, I didn't really know who Dr. Feser was till about 2 years ago when a group of students kept harassing me to go read this philosopher's blog. And so I finally got around to it and I said, this is a great philosopher and Thomist here. Picked up a few of his books, particularly The Last Superstition, and was very excited. And I was in California last year, and he teaches at Pasadena City College. And so we were having a beer, sitting around visiting, and invited him to come, and he said he'd be happy to. So his first trip to southern Louisiana. Very happy to have him here. Dr. Feser has his doctorate in philosophy from UC Santa Barbara and currently teaches philosophy at Pasadena City College. Is known for his blog, which has 4,000 hits a day, more or less, something like that, and a number of books, probably most famously for his Beginner's Guide to St. Thomas Aquinas and to The Last Superstition, which is the only philosophy book I've ever read that I repeatedly laughed out loud at. But it's profound and really refutes contemporary atheism. So we're so glad so many of you came. Dr. Feser is going to give his lecture and then afterwards entertain a few questions. And I know some of you may have brought your copies of his books. I'm sure he'd be happy to go ahead and sign them. So thanks so much for coming, and let's welcome Dr. Edward Feser.
Turn this electronic doohickey, is it working? Okay. High tech. I feel like the Tony Stark of philosophy for you. Comic book geeks out there, you get the reference. Iron Man. Watch me electrocute myself now. For safety reasons, I told him to put gin rather than water in here, so I didn't do that. Thanks so much, Father Sibley, for the introduction, for the invitation out here. A lot of my atheist readers tell me that they also laugh at my work, so I think it may be a different spirit. What I'm presenting tonight is, in one way, an overlap with, and another way, a departure from some of the material that you'll find in books like The Last Superstition and in Aquinas. People who've read those books know that I devote about 70 pages or so in each of them to some rather highfalutin and very abstract metaphysics before I even get into the question of God's existence or questions about morality or what have you. And the reason for that is that in both books I am presenting and defending arguments from writers like St. Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle, and I'm doing so in more or less a historical sequence, so I have to kind of set the stage and provide the intellectual background, the conceptual background to their arguments before I can get to the arguments themselves. But that means that the reader is asked to do some pretty abstract work and to be, frankly, fairly patient before I actually get into the question of the existence of God. Well, what I want to present tonight, it's actually a working draft, a partial draft, actually, of a chapter in one of the several book projects I'm working on, which is an attempt to approach things more directly, to approach the at least one in this case, in this particular chapter, one of the arguments for God's existence, an Aristotelian style argument for God's existence, but in a way that doesn't start out with all the background abstract metaphysics, but gets right into the argument and introduces the relevant background philosophical concepts along the way. So hopefully that will make it a little more intelligible. Probably not more interesting, but I'll do what I can. I'll try to make it a dramatic reading or something, but that's the background to the material I'm going to be presenting tonight. So I asked Father to hand out some handouts here I use in different contexts, for example, in classes I teach. And you'll see on the first page there's a little summary of Aquinas' first way, which is a version of it's called the argument from motion for an unmoved mover. It goes back to Plato and Aristotle. And then at the bottom of that front page, there's a reconstruction of that argument that I presented in a recent philosophical article that matches up a little more closely to the version of the argument I'll be presenting in the paper tonight. I'm going to try to present it in a less abstract way than you see there on the handout. And then on the rest of the pages of the handout, there are some other concepts and arguments that I'm going to make reference to as we go along. So I'll be referring to that at least in a very general way as we go along. And I want to try to do three things in the course of the argument. First, I want to sketch out the general argument for the existence of God, proceeding in the way that you find Aristotle and Aquinas did, though I'm not stating the argument exactly the way they did. I'm rather going to try to state it in a way that that cuts through a lot of the interpretive issues that often arise when one discusses Aristotle and Aquinas. Try to present the argument in a way that makes it clear that it has nothing essentially to do with outdated Aristotelian physics or the like. That's what I want to do in the first part of the talk tonight. Second part, I want to show how the cause of the world, or the unmoved mover of the world, or however you want to describe it, that you arrive at the end of this argument for God's existence, does indeed have all the key divine attributes, is indeed a cause of the world that we can characterize as all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good, immaterial, and so on and so forth. And then the third part of the talk, I want to address some of the standard objections that are made to arguments to God's existence, for God's existence in general, and arguments of the sort I'll be presenting tonight in particular. All right, let me start then with what I'll call stage one of the argument for the existence of an unmoved mover of the world, or an uncaused cause of the world. It's one that begins from premises that everyone knows from ordinary everyday life. So to get right into it, change occurs. Examples are all around us. The coffee in your cup grows cooler. A leaf on the tree outside your window falls to the ground. A puddle grows larger as the rain continues. You swat a fly and it dies. These examples illustrate four kinds of change. Qualitative change, in this case the coffee cools down. Change with respect to location, the leaf falls from the tree. Quantitative change, the puddle increases in size. And substantial change, a living thing gives way to dead matter when you swat the fly. That changes of these sorts occur is evident from our sensory experience of the world outside our minds. Now, suppose our senses are deceiving us. Suppose your entire life has been one long dream or hallucination of the sort that Descartes describes in his book, The Meditations on First Philosophy, and which has been dramatized in science fiction films like The Matrix. Still, even in that case, there would be no doubt, even in this far-fetched scenario, that change occurs. You have one experience, then another. You consider whether you're dreaming or hallucinating, then you dismiss the idea as too silly to bother with. Then you find that you're still troubled by the arguments that you read in Descartes, and wonder whether there might be something to them after all. But that too is a kind of change with respect to your thoughts and experiences. Now, might even those changes be a kind of illusion? After all, the Greek philosopher Parmenides notoriously argued that when we carefully analyze what change of any sort would have to involve, we'll see that it is impossible. Consider once again your coffee, which starts out hot and after sitting on the desk for a while grows cold. You might say that the coldness of the coffee, which does not exist while the coffee is hot, comes into existence. But now we have a problem, says Parmenides. For if the coldness of the coffee was initially non-existent, then at that point it was nothing. And when it later comes into existence, it is then something. But something can't come from nothing. So the coldness of the coffee cannot come into existence, and thus the coffee cannot grow cold. Something similar could be said for any purported case of change. All of them would have to involve something coming from nothing, which is impossible. And hence, concludes Parmenides anyway, change cannot ever really occur. Now, perhaps you suspect there's something fishy about this argument, and if so, you'd be right. One problem is that no one could possibly coherently accept it. Suppose you try to convince someone, even if only yourself, that change is an illusion, whether via Parmenides' argument or some other argument. You work your way through each step until you or your listener is convinced. Yet that your mind entertains one premise after the other and finally reaches the conclusion is itself an instance of the change that the argument denies. The very act of casting doubt on whether change occurs thus presupposes that it occurs. Now, there's another problem with Parmenides' argument. As the later Greek philosopher Aristotle pointed out, it's a mistake to think that change would have to involve something coming from nothing. Go back to the coffee. It's true that while the coffee is hot, the coldness is not actually present. Still, it is there potentially in a way other qualities are not. The coffee does not, after all, have the potential to fuel a gasoline engine, or to turn itself into chicken soup, or for that matter, to morph into a live chicken and begin squawking. But it does have the potential to grow cold, and it has various other potentials too, to make you more alert if you drink it, to stain the floor if you spill it, and so forth. That it has the potential to become cold while lacking certain other potentials shows that the coldness is not exactly nothing, even if it is not actual either. What change involves then is, for Aristotle, the actualization of a potential. The coffee has the potential to become cold, and after sitting out for a while, that potential is made actual. This is not a case of something coming from nothing, which Aristotle agrees is impossible, because again, a potential is not nothing. So, again, change occurs. Everyday experience shows that it does, and a little philosophical reflection not only reinforces this judgment, but explains what change involves. But how does change occur? It's our next question. Now that depends on the change, of course. The coffee's getting cold is not the same kind of process as the falling of the leaf, or the puddles growing larger, or the flies being swatted. Still, whatever sort of change is in question, there will be something or other that brings it about. In short, change requires a changer. We find examples all around us in everyday experience. The cool air in the room brings the temperature of the coffee down. A flick of your wrist brings the fly swatter down on the fly. But the thesis that change requires a changer is not merely a generalization from instances like these. It follows from what change is, namely the actualization of a potential. We saw that while the coffee is still hot, the coldness of the coffee is not exactly nothing, since it is there potentially in the coffee in a way other qualities are not. But it is still there merely potentially and not actually, otherwise the coffee would be cold already, even while it is hot, which of course it is not. Now, potential coldness can hardly do anything precisely because it is merely potential. Only what is actual can do anything. In particular, potential coldness of the coffee cannot make itself actual. Only something already actual can do that. The coolness in the surrounding air, or perhaps some ice cubes you might drop into the coffee. In general, any mere potential can only be actualized by something that's already actual. In that sense, any change requires a changer of some sort or other. So, change occurs and any change requires a cause. Or to put it less colloquially but more precisely, some potentials are actualized, and when they are, there must be something already actual which actualizes them. Now, notice that often what is true of the thing being changed is also true of the thing changing it. The coolness of the air in the room makes the coffee cold, but the coolness of the air was itself merely potential until the air conditioner actualized it. The flick of your wrist causes the fly swatter to come down hard, and its impact in turn kills the fly. But the flick of your wrist was itself merely potential until the firing of certain motor neurons actualized it. So when something causes a change, that is sometimes because it is undergoing a change itself. And when that is the case, that change too requires a changer. Or once again, to put things less colloquially but more precisely, sometimes when a potential is being actualized, what actualizes it is itself something which has gone from potential to actual. And when that is the case, there must have been some further thing which made that happen. Now, notice that I did not say that everything which causes a change must be undergoing change itself. That doesn't follow from anything said so far, and as we'll see, it's not true. The point is rather that if something which causes a change is undergoing change itself, then that change requires a changer of its own. So, we sometimes have a series of changers and things changed. The coldness of the coffee was caused by the coldness in the surrounding air, which was caused by the air conditioner, which was caused by to switch on when you press the appropriate button. The fly was killed by the impact of the fly swatter, which was caused by the flick of your wrist, which was caused by the firing of certain motor neurons, which was caused by your annoyance at the flies buzzing around the room. One potential was actualized by another, which was in turn actualized by another, which was actualized by yet another. Now, so far this has all been common sense, supplemented with some semi-technical jargon. But the jargon will help us to move beyond common sense, not to contradict it, but rather to follow out its implications. Consider next that series of changes of the sort we've described typically extend backward in time in what we might think of as a linear fashion. The coffee is cold because the air in the room cooled it. The air was cold because of the air conditioner. The air conditioner went on because you pressed a certain button, and so forth. Now let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that this series extends backwards into the past to infinity without a beginning. You press the button, your desire to cool down the room caused you to do that. The effect of the room's heat on your skin brought about that desire. The sun generated that heat, and so on and so on and on, until without there being any temporally first member of this series of changes and changers. The material world, we are supposing, for the sake of argument, has always been here and has always been changing. That, as it happens, is what Aristotle himself thought. Now, these days, it is often supposed that the Big Bang theory shows that he was wrong. On the other hand, some scientists have suggested that the Big Bang was itself a result of an earlier universe imploding, or perhaps involved our universe branching off from some other parallel universe. It is also sometimes suggested that the series of such pre-existing universes is infinite, so that even if our particular universe had a beginning, the series as a whole did not. This is all very dubious, in my opinion, but whether it is true or not simply doesn't matter for our purposes. Again, let us grant, for the sake of argument, that the universe or a multiverse comprising our universe together with other universes has no beginning but has always existed. Okay, even if such linear series of changes and changers might in theory extend backward to infinity with no first member, there is another kind of series, let us call it the hierarchical kind, which must have a first member. And incidentally, on the second page of the handout, we see what I'm alluding to. This is the distinction between what's sometimes called essentially ordered versus accidentally ordered causal series, or as I already put it, and as I refer to it in the handout as well, linear versus hierarchical causal series. So let me say a bit about the difference here. Remember that we are thinking of a linear series as extending backward in time. The coffee got cold because the room was cool. The room was cool because the air conditioner had made it so. You'd switched on the air conditioner because you didn't like the heat. The heat had been generated by the sun, and so forth. To understand what a hierarchical series is, it will be useful by contrast to think instead of what might exist at a single moment of time. Now, this is not in fact essential to a hierarchical series, but it is a useful way to introduce the idea. So consider once again the coffee cup as it sits on your desk. It is, we may suppose, 3 feet above the floor. Why? Because the desk is holding it up naturally. But what holds the desk up? The answer, of course, is the floor. The floor, in turn, is held up by the foundation of the house, and the foundation of the house by the earth. Now, unlike the coffee being cooled by the surrounding air, which is in turn cooled by the air conditioner, and so forth, this is not a series which need be thought of as extending backward in time. Of course, the cup may in fact have been sitting there on the desk for hours, but the point is that even if we consider the cup as it sits there at some particular moment, it is sitting there at that moment only because the desk is holding it up at that moment. And the desk is holding it up at that moment only because it is in turn being held up at that moment by the floor. Or consider the lamp above your head, which is held up by a chain, which is in turn held up by the fixture screwed into the ceiling, all at the same moment. In both cases, we have what I've called a hierarchical series of causes. In the first case, tracing downward to the ground, and in the other case, upward to the ceiling. Now, since we're considering each of these hierarchical series as existing in a particular moment of time, rather than over the course of minutes or hours, it might seem odd to think of them as involving change. But our consideration of the nature of change led us to introduce the idea of actualizing a potential, and each of these series does involve that. The potential of the cup to be 3 feet off the ground is actualized by the desk. Potential of the desk to hold the cup aloft is actualized by the floor, and so forth. Similarly, the potential of the lamp to be 7 feet from the ground is actualized by the chain, and the potential of the chain to hold the lamp aloft is actualized by the fixture screwed into the ceiling. What makes these series hierarchical in the relevant sense, though, is not that they are simultaneous, but that there is a certain sort of dependence of the later members on the earlier ones. The cup has no capacity on its own to be 3 feet off the ground. It will be there only if something else, such as the desk, holds it up. But the desk, in turn, has no power on its own to hold the cup there. The desk, too, would fall to the earth unless the floor held it aloft, and the floor, for that matter, can hold up the desk only because it is itself being held up by the house's foundation, and the foundation, in turn, by the earth. Similarly, the lamp can hang there at 7 feet off the ground only because the chain is holding it there, while the chain can hold it there only because it is, in turn, being held up by the fixture, and the fixture by the ceiling. The ceiling, however, can hold up the fixture only because it is being held up by the walls, which are also held up by the foundation, which is held up by the earth. So you might say that it is really the earth that is holding up both the cup and the lamp, and that it is doing it through these intermediaries. The desk, chain, walls, and floor have no power to hold anything up except insofar as they derive that power from the earth. They are in that sense like instruments just as it's not a brush which paints a picture, but rather the painter who uses the brush as an instrument who paints it. So too, it is the earth which holds up the cup and the lamp, with the floor, walls, desk, chain, and so forth serving, as it were, as its instruments. What makes a hierarchical series of causes hierarchical, then, is this instrumental or derivative character of the later members of the series. The desk will hold the cup aloft only so long as it is itself being held up by the floor. If the floor collapses, the desk will go with it, and the cup will fall as a result. The members of a linear series, sort we've been describing as extending backward in time, are not like that. The air conditioner is on because you turned it on. Still, once you've done so, the air conditioner will keep cooling the room even if you left the house or dropped dead. Now, it's because of this difference that a hierarchical series of causes has to have a first member, while a linear series does not. We're working our way here to God, to the unmoved mover. But it's crucial to understand what first means in this context. As has already been indicated, the idea of a hierarchical series is best introduced by thinking in terms of a sequence whose members exist all together at a single moment of time, such as the cup, which is held up by the desk, which is held up by the floor. So when it's said that such a series must have a first member, the claim is not that the series has to be traced back to some beginning point in the past, that the Big Bang say. The idea is rather this. Since the desk, the floor, and the foundation have no power of their own to hold the cup aloft, the series could not exist in the first place unless there were something that did have the power to hold up these intermediaries and the cup through them, without having to be held up itself. You might say that if the desk, floor, walls, and so forth are acting like instruments of a sort, then there must, as it were, be something whose instruments they are. Or to put the point another way, if they have only derivative power to hold things up, there must be something from which they derive it, something which does not have to derive it from anything else, but just has it built in. The sort of first cause that a hierarchical series must have, then, is a cause that has the power to produce its effects in a non-derivative and non-instrumental way. In the case of the cup, where the desk holds it up only because it derives its power to do so from the floor, and the floor from the foundation, none of these things could hold up anything at all unless there were something which holds them up without having to be held up itself. Now, it was suggested earlier that we could think of the earth as the first cause in this series, since there's an obvious sense in which it holds up the floor, walls, desk, cup, and lamp, while nothing is holding the earth itself up. In fact, even the earth is not a first cause in the strict sense, but we'll come back to that. The point to emphasize for now is that it is being the sort of thing that has non-derived causal power, being the sort of thing that can actualize a potential without itself having to be actualized, that makes something a first cause in the sense relevant to understanding a hierarchical series of causes. As I've already said, being first in a temporal sense, in the sense of coming at some beginning point in time, is not what's at issue. But even the idea of a series of causes that's only finitely rather than infinitely long is not essential to the notion of a hierarchical causal series. To take an example sometimes used to illustrate the point, a paintbrush has no power to move itself, and it would remain powerless to move itself, even if its handle were infinitely long. Hence, even if there could be an infinitely long brush handle, if it's actually going to move, there will still have to be something outside it which does have the built-in power to cause it to move. Or to return to our own example, a desk has no power all on its own to hold up the cup, and thus an infinite series of desks, if there could be such a thing, would be as powerless to hold it up as a single desk would be. Hence, even if such a series existed, there would have to be something outside it which could impart to it the power to hold up the cup. When we say that a hierarchical series of causes has to have a first member, then, we don't mean first in the sense of being the one that comes before the second, third, fourth, fifth, and so on. Rather, we mean it's the first cause in the sense that it has an inherent or built-in causal power, while the others have only derivative causal power. It is their having only derivative causal power that makes the other members secondary rather than first or primary causes. Now, let's pause to take stock because things have gotten a bit abstract. We started out by noting that there could be no doubt that change occurs, and that change can occur only if things have potentials which can be actualized. We also saw that any change requires a changer in the sense that whenever a potential is actualized, there must be something already actual that actualizes it. Having introduced this distinction between what is potential and what is actual, we went on to make a further distinction between two kinds of series in which one potential is actualized by another, which is actualized by another. The first sort, which we called a linear series, is the sort we usually imagine when we think of change. It was illustrated by the coffee being cooled by the surrounding air in the room, which was itself cooled by the air conditioner, which was turned on as a result of your having pressed a certain button and so forth. In this sort of series, the members have their own causal power. After you've turned it on, the air conditioner can continue to cool the room even after you're no longer present. Even the air will remain cool for some time after the air conditioner is turned off and will therefore retain the power to cool down the coffee. What we call the hierarchical series, however, is very different. Here, every cause other than the first has its causal power only in a derivative way. Thus, the desk, floor, and foundation have no power to hold aloft the coffee cup except insofar as they derive it from the earth that this whole series rests on. This takes us beyond what we would ordinarily think of as change, because we would ordinarily think of the sequence of the cup, desk, floor, foundation, and earth as simultaneous. But what matters is that we do still have the actualization of potentials, the notion of which, the idea of which, was introduced as a way of making sense of change. The potential of the cup to be 3 feet off the ground is actualized by the desk. The desk potential to hold the cup aloft is actualized by the floor, and so forth. Now, it's this second hierarchical sort of series, now that we've introduced it, that ultimately concerns us here, for it is more fundamental to reality than the other linear sort of series is. The hierarchical sort is the more basic one, and that's the one that leads us ultimately to an uncaused cause of the world. To be sure, it is at first easier for us to recognize and understand the linear sort of series because the kinds of change that it involves are familiar to us from everyday experience. By contrast, introducing the notion of a hierarchical series required us first to abstract from this everyday experience the notion of actualizing a potential, and then to apply that idea to a context to which the passage of time is not essential. But once we've done that, we can see that every series of the linear sort presupposes series of the hierarchical sort. We can see that to understand the changes that we observe all around us in everyday life, coffee getting cold, the fly being swatted, and so on, we need to understand how hierarchical series trace down to first causes, and indeed to a single first cause. How so? Wait for it. Boy, now it better be good, right? Okay. Go back to the coffee in the cup. To state the obvious, it can get cold or be held up by the desk only if it exists. Non-existent coffee cannot do either, or anything else for that matter. Now, what makes it the case that the coffee exists? Obviously, someone made it by pouring hot water through coffee grounds, but that's not what I'm talking about. I mean, what makes it true that the coffee exists here and now, and at any particular moment that it exists? What keeps it in existence? For one thing, the coffee will exist only insofar as the water that makes up the bulk of it exists. So to simplify things somewhat, let's consider that. Let's consider the water. What keeps the water in existence at any particular moment? After all, given the chemistry of the water, the matter that makes it up also has the potential to exist instead as distinct quantities of oxygen and hydrogen. But that is not the potential that is being actualized right now. Instead, it is that matter's potential to exist as water that is being actualized right now. Why? It's no good to answer that such and such a process occurred at some time in the past so as to combine the hydrogen and oxygen in just the right way. That tells us how the water got here, but that's not what we're asking about. It is also no good to point out that nothing has yet come along to separate out the hydrogen and oxygen. That tells us how the water might someday go out of existence, but that isn't what we're asking about either. What we're asking about, again, is what keeps the water in existence at any instant at which it does in fact exist. You might say that it has to do with chemical bonding between atoms, but that merely rephrases rather than answers the problem. For the atoms have the potential to be bonded in other ways, and yet they are not so bonded. It is a potential to be bonded in such a way that water results that is in fact being actualized. Again, why? Appealing to the structure of the atom won't answer the question either, but merely pushes it back a stage. For why are the subatomic particles combined in just the specific way that they are, here and now, rather than some other way? What is it that actualizes that potential rather than some other one? What we have here, as you may have noticed, is something like the cup, which is held up by the desk, which is held up by the floor. Only in this case, it is the very existence of a thing that is at issue, rather than merely its particular spatial location. The potential of the coffee to exist here and now is actualized in part by the existence of the water, which in turn exists only because a certain potential of the atoms is being actualized, where these atoms themselves exist only because a certain potential of the subatomic particles is being actualized. This is a hierarchical series, one which, as we've seen, must have a first member. We've also seen that what it means for such a series to have a first member is that there's something which can impart causal power to the other members of the series without having to have that power imparted to it. Something that has its causal power in a built-in or non-derivative way. It doesn't have to get it from anything else. Now, since what is being explained in this case is the actualization of a thing's potential for existence, the sort of first cause we're talking about is one which can actualize the potential for things to exist without having to have its own existence actualized by anything. What this entails is that this cause doesn't have any potential for existence that needs to be actualized in the first place. It just is actual, always and already actual, as it were. Indeed, you might say that it doesn't merely have actuality the way the things it actualizes do, but that it just is pure actuality itself. It doesn't merely happen not to have a cause of its own, but could not in principle have had or needed a cause of its own. For being devoid of potentiality, just being pure actuality with no potentiality, there's nothing in it that could have needed any actualizing the way other things do. It is in this sense that it is an uncaused cause, or to use Aristotle's famous expression, an unmoved mover. More precisely, we might call it an unactualized actualizer. And less commonsensical, not using common sense language here, but it's more technically precise language. Now, we've reached this result from a consideration of everyday phenomena, but things have gotten even more abstract, so let's briefly retrace our steps. We started with the observation that change occurs and saw that this cannot coherently be denied. You can't deny that change occurs. We then saw that change can occur only if the things that change have potentials which can be actualized. Potential to be cooled down, potential to grow in size, or what have you, since change is just the actualization of a potential. And we saw that change requires a changer insofar as a potential can be actualized only by something already actual. Now, we then noted that there are, on the one hand, series of changes of what we called a linear sort, the kind illustrated by the coffee, which was cooled down by the air, which was cooled down by the air conditioner, which was switched on when you pressed a button. That kind of series does not require a first member. But we also saw that there's another kind of series in which one potential is actualized by another, which is in turn actualized by another, in which there must be a first member. In this hierarchical sort of series, the first member is first in the sense that it can cause other things without being caused itself. It has its causal power in a primary, inherent, or built-in way, whereas the other members of the series have their causal power in only a secondary or derivative way. Now, we saw next that linear series of changes are less fundamental than the hierarchical sort of series. Things can change only because they exist. The coffee, for example, cannot grow cold unless it exists. And for a thing to exist at any particular moment requires that it be actualized at that moment, at least if it's the sort of thing which has the potential either to exist or not to exist. This, in turn, is possible only if there is a cause of the existence of things which can actualize their potential for existence without having to be actualized itself, a purely actual actualizer of the existence of things. And so from the fact that change occurs, we are led to conclude that there is an unactualized actualizer or unmoved mover or uncaused cause of the existence of things. All right, that's the first stage of the argument. I know what you're thinking. We're only 1/3 through. Actually, halfway by my page count, so it's not quite as bad as you. Still bad, but it's Lent, offered up. Okay, now that brings us to stage 2 of the argument. We've gotten to an uncaused cause, an unactualized actualizer, an unmoved mover. In other words, the undeniable reality of change entails the existence of God. Now, why call the unactualized actualizer or unmoved mover God? For one thing, this cause is, among other things, the ultimate cause of the existence of things, in the most intimate sense of being that which keeps them in existence at any moment at which they exist at all. And whatever else God is supposed to be, he's the ultimate cause of things. For another thing, various further attributes definitive of God as traditionally conceived follow from what has already been said. For example, since the cause of things is pure actuality and therefore devoid of any potentiality, it cannot go from potentiality to actuality and is thus immutable or unchanging. It's an unchanging cause of all things. Since existing within time entails changeability, anything that exists in time goes from one point in time to another is changeable, an immutable or unchangeable cause must also be eternal in the sense of existing outside of time altogether. It neither comes to be nor passes away, but simply is, timelessly, without beginning or end. Since to be material entails being changeable and existing within time, an immutable or unchanging and eternal cause must also be immaterial, and thus incorporeal or without any sort of body. Consider now what it is for a thing to be in some respect or other imperfect or flawed. An injured animal or a damaged plant is imperfect insofar as it is no longer capable of realizing fully the ends that its nature has set for it. For instance, a squirrel which has been hit by a car may be unable to run away from predators as swiftly as it needs to, and a tree whose roots have been damaged may be unstable or unable to take in all the water and nutrients it needs in order to remain healthy. A defect of this sort is, to use some traditional philosophical jargon, a privation, the absence of some feature that a thing would naturally require so as to be complete. It involves the failure to realize some potential that's inherent in a thing. Something is perfect then to the extent that it has actualized such potentials and is without privations. But then a purely actual cause of things, precisely since it is purely actual and thus devoid of any unrealized potentiality or privation, possesses maximal perfection. Now, could there be more than one such uncaused cause, the world? We've said it's immutable or unchanging, it's outside time altogether, it's not a material thing, it's immaterial or non-physical, it's perfect. Could there be more than one such cause? There could not be, not even in principle. For there can be two or more of a kind of thing only if there is something to differentiate them, something that one instance has that the others lack, something that at least in principle would allow us to distinguish one from the other. And there can be no such differentiating feature where something purely actual is concerned. Thus, we typically distinguish the things of our experience by their material or temporal features, by one thing being larger or smaller than another, say, or taller or shorter than another, or existing at a time before or after another. But since what is purely actual, the unactualized actualizer of all things, is immaterial and eternal, one purely actual thing could not be differentiated from another in terms of such features like location in space or existing before and after another in time. More generally, two or more things of a kind are to be differentiated from one another in terms of some perfection or privation that one has and the other one lacks. We might say, for instance, that this tree's roots are more sturdy than that one's, or that this squirrel is lacking its tail while the other has its tail, or that this speaker is interesting while this other one is boring. I don't like that. Scratch that out of this. But as we've seen, what is purely actual is completely devoid of any privation and is maximal in perfection. Hence, there can be no way in principle to differentiate one purely actual cause from another in terms of their respective perfections or privations. But then such a cause possesses the attribute of unity. That is to say, there cannot be, even in principle, more than one purely actual cause, because in something that's purely actual, there's no way, even in theory, to distinguish one of them from another in terms of a feature one of them has and the other one doesn't have. So we've argued so far that the uncaused cause of the world has to be absolutely unique. There can only be one, even in theory. It's not a material thing. It's outside time and space. It's unchanging. It's perfect. Consider now the question of whether this cause of the world has power, is all-powerful, omnipotent. Well, to have power is just to be able to make something happen, to actualize some potential, in other words. I have the power to pick up this cup in the sense that I have the power to actualize its potential to be raised into the air. But then, since the cause of the existence of all things is pure actuality itself rather than merely one actual thing among others, that which is the source of all the actualizing power everything else has, it has all possible power. It is, in short, omnipotent. Consider further that a thing is good, in a general sense, to the extent that it realizes the potentials inherent in it as the kind of thing it is, and bad to the extent that it fails to realize them. A good painter, for example, is good to the extent that he's realized his potential for mastery of the various aspects of painting, craftsmanship, composition, and so forth, while a bad painter is bad to the extent that he has failed to acquire the relevant skills. But a purely actual cause of the world, devoid as it is of potentiality, cannot be said to be bad or deficient in any way, but on the contrary, as we've seen, to be perfect. In that sense, such a cause must be fully good. So far then, we've seen that the purely actual actualizer or unmoved mover or uncaused cause of the world must be one, absolutely unique. There can be, even in theory, no more than one. Immutable or unchangeable, eternal, immaterial, incorporeal, perfect, omnipotent, and fully good. And a cause of the existence of things, in the sense of being that which keeps all things in being from moment to moment. Can we attribute attributes of a more personal nature to this cause? For instance, can we attribute to it something like intelligence? We can. But to see how, we must first say something about the nature of intelligence and also something more about the nature of cause and effect. So, brief digression here. Now, intelligence as traditionally understood in scholastic writers like Thomas Aquinas and in writers going back to the ancient Greeks like Aristotle, intelligence as traditionally understood involves three basic capacities. First, there's the capacity to grasp abstract concepts, such as the concept man, which is what you have when you not only know this or that particular man or this or that particular subset of men, but when you know what it is to be a man in general. To have the concept man is to have a universal idea that applies to all possible men, not only those that do exist or have existed, but also, excuse me, all those that could exist. Second, there's the capacity to put these ideas together into complete thoughts. This is the second aspect of intelligence, as when you combine the concept man and the concept mortal in the thought that all men are mortal. And third, there's the capacity to infer one thought from others, as when you reason from the premises that all men are mortal and Socrates is a man, to the conclusion that Socrates is mortal. Obviously, the capacity to grasp abstract or universal concepts is the most fundamental of these three. You couldn't form complete thoughts or reason from one thought to another if you didn't have the concepts that are the constituents of the thoughts. Now, to have such a concept is to have a kind of form or pattern in the mind, and the same form or pattern that exists in the things that you think about. There's a form or pattern that all men have that makes them all the same thing, namely men. There's a form or pattern that all triangles have that makes them all the same thing, namely triangles, and so forth. Now, when these forms or patterns come to exist in material things, the results are the various individual objects, individual men, individual triangles, etc., that we find in the world around us. When we think about men or triangles in general, though, we abstract away from all the different particular men and triangles and focus on what is common or universal to them. And that is really the essence of strictly intellectual activity, the capacity to have the universal or abstract form or pattern of a thing without being that kind of thing. A material object that has the form or pattern of a triangle just is a triangle. But when you contemplate what it is to be a triangle, you have that same form or pattern of being a triangle as well, but without being a triangle. Now, we'll come back to the notion of intelligence in a moment, but let's first say a little more about cause and effect. We've noted that when something is either changed or caused to exist, a potential is actualized, and that something already actual must be what actualizes it. This is sometimes called the principle of causality. A further point to make about cause and effect, though, is that whatever is in some effect must in some way or other be in the cause, even if not always in the same way. For a cause cannot give what it doesn't have to give. This is sometimes called the principle of proportionate causality. We need to add this in to see why the cause of the world must have intelligence. So, suppose, for example, that I give you $20. I lend you $20. The effect in this case is you're having the $20 and I'm the cause of this effect. But the only way I can cause that effect is if I have the $20 to give you in the first place. Now, there's several ways in which I might have it. I might have a $20 bill in my wallet, or two $10 bills, or four $5 bills, or $20 in pennies or something, like Kramer in that Seinfeld episode where he buys the cannolis. Or I may have no money in my wallet, but do have $20 in my bank account and write you a check. Or I may not have even that, but I'm able to borrow the $20 from someone else, or work for it so that I can give it to you. Or sell copies of The Last Superstition, which is available, by the way. Buy early and often. Did I mention I have 6 kids? A wife with expensive taste? Oh, this is being taped. Just kidding, honey. Or perhaps I have a friend who has the key to the U.S. Treasury printing press, and I get him to run off an official $20 bill for me to give to you. Or to take an even more far-fetched scenario, suppose that in order to guarantee that you get the $20, I somehow convinced Congress to pass a law which permits me personally to manufacture my own $20 bills. These are all various ways in which I might, in theory, give you $20. But if none of these ways are available to me, then I can't do it. Again, these are different ways in which the cause may have what is in the effect. When I myself have a $20 bill ready to hand and I cause you to have it, what is in the effect was in the cause formally, to use some traditional jargon. That is to say, I myself was an instance of the form or pattern of having a $20 bill, and I caused you to become another instance of that form or pattern. When I don't have the $20 bill ready to hand, but I do have at least $20 credit in my bank account, you might say that what was in the effect was in that case in the cause virtually. For though I didn't actually have the $20 on hand, I did have the power to get hold of it. And when I get Congress to grant me the power to manufacture $20 bills, you might say, once again to use some traditional jargon, that I had the $20 imminently. Because in that case, I not only have the power to acquire existing $20 bills, but the more imminent or higher power of causing them to exist in the first place. When it is said then that what is in an effect must in some way be in the cause, what is meant is that it must be in the cause at least virtually or eminently, even if not formally, to use that jargon again. Now, consider once again the purely actual actualizer or uncaused cause of the existence of things. We've seen that the existence of anything that might exist is going to trace to this one cause. It's the cause of every possible thing that might exist. Now, to cause a thing to exist is precisely to cause something of a particular sort, a stone rather than a tree, say, or a tree rather than a cat. That is to say, to cause something to exist is just to cause something having a certain form or fitting a certain pattern. But as we've just said, the purely actual cause of things is the cause of every possible thing, every possible cat, every possible tree, every possible stone. It is for that reason the cause of every possible form or pattern that a thing might have. We've also noted that whatever is in an effect must in some way or other be in its cause. Put these points together, and what follows is that the forms or patterns of things must exist in the purely actual cause of things. And they must exist in it in a completely universal or abstract way, because this cause is the cause of every possible thing fitting a certain form or pattern. But to have forms or patterns in this universal or abstract way is just to have that capacity which is fundamental to intelligence. That's the core of intelligence. Having a form or pattern of a thing within you without being that kind of thing. Add to this consideration the fact that this cause of things is not just the cause of things themselves, but of their being related in any way that they might be related. That is to say, it's not only the cause of men, but of the fact that all men are mortal. It's not just the cause of this cat, but of this cat's being on this mat, and so forth. So, there must be some sense in which these effects, too, exist in their purely actual cause. And it must be in a way that has to do with the combination of the forms or patterns that exist in that cause. That is to say, the effects must exist in the cause in something like the way thoughts exist in us. We not only have individual concepts, but complete thoughts. And in the same way, the uncaused cause of things, the purely actual actualizer of everything that happens at every instant, is not only the cause of individual entities, but also their relations to one another. The fact that all men are mortal, the fact that that this particular cat's on this particular mat. So there must be something corresponding to those facts or states of affairs in the cause of the world, which means there must be something that is analogous to what we call a complete thought in us. So, what exists in the things that the purely actual cause is the cause of, pre-exists in that cause in something like the way that the things we make pre-exist as ideas or plans in our minds before we make them. These things thereby exist in that purely actual cause eminently and virtually, even if not formally. For the cause of things is not itself a cat or a tree, and cannot be, given that it is immaterial. But it can cause a cat or a tree, or anything else that might exist. But it's not merely intelligence that we can therefore attribute to the cause of things. Consider that as the intelligent cause of everything that exists or could exist, there is nothing that exists or could exist, even for an instant, that is not in the range of this cause's thoughts. In that sense, this cause is all-knowing or omniscient. Now, much more could be said. I know you want me to, but I'll resist. I always keep begging for less, as it turns out, but just a little more to go here. But this sketch should make it clear enough that we could say a great deal about the nature of the cause of things, and in particular a great deal to show that this cause really does fit the description of God as traditionally conceived. Now, let's briefly summarize. We've seen that it cannot coherently be denied that change occurs, And we've noted that change can occur only if things have potentials which are actualized by something already actual. Hence, the hot coffee has the potential to be cooled, and that potential is actualized by the coolness in the surrounding air. We've also argued that while a linear series of changes and changers might in principle extend backward in time without beginning, the members of these series must depend at any moment at which they exist on a hierarchical series of actualizers, and that such a series must terminate in a purely actual cause or actualizer of their existence. And it has now been argued that any such cause must be one, absolutely unique, immutable or unchanging, eternal, without beginning or end, immaterial, incorporeal or not a bodily entity, perfect, omnipotent or all-powerful, fully good, intelligent, and omniscient or all-knowing. That is to say, it must have the key divine attributes. In short, the things of our experience can exist at any moment only if sustained in existence by God. Naturally, all sorts of objections are bound to be raised against this argument. They too deserve a full treatment. You could give a whole talk just on those. But let me just briefly address right away some objections that might, to some listeners, appear obvious. For example, some are bound to think that I've been arguing that if we trace the series of causes of things back in time, we'll get to a beginning of the universe and that God was the cause of that beginning. Now, I've tried to make it clear that that's not what I'm saying, but people are so used to thinking of an argument for God's existence in those terms that they'll read this idea even into an argument that explicitly denies it. And then they're bound to go on to ask how we can be so sure that the universe really did have a beginning. But what I said, remember, is that even if a given series of changes has no beginning in time, even if the universe or series of universes extends forever into the past, that would be irrelevant to the argument that I've been giving over the past half hour, 45 minutes or so. For the argument is rather that for things to exist here and now, and at any moment at which they exist, they must be here and now sustained in existence by God. Similarly, some might suppose that the argument proceeds from the assumption that the entire universe has to have some cause. And then they'll go on to object that even if this or that part of the universe has a cause, it doesn't follow that the whole universe has one. But in fact, the claim that the universe as a whole has a cause is not a premise of the argument that I've been defending. What I argued was that for any particular thing to exist at any moment, God must be causing it to exist at that moment. To argue for the existence of God, you don't need to start from the claim that the universe had a beginning. And you don't need to start with any other claim about the universe as a whole either. You can start with any old trivial object existing here and now, a stone, a cup of coffee, whatever. Because even for that thing, one thing to exist, even for a moment, there must be a purely actual cause actualizing it at that moment. Now, it's true that I also went on to claim that this applied to everything that exists, and so I did make a claim about the universe as a whole. But that claim was a consequence of the argument, not a premise of the argument. Another stock objection raised against arguments like the one just presented goes like this. If everything is a cause, then what caused God? If we say that God does not have a cause, then maybe other things don't have a cause either. The argument, so the critic claims, commits the fallacy of special pleading, making an arbitrary exception in God's case to the rule that it applies to everything else. But in fact, this objection is no good, and the argument I've been developing does not commit any fallacy of special pleading. First of all, the argument does not rest in the first place on the premise that everything has a cause. What it says is that any change requires a cause. More precisely, that whatever goes from potential to actual has a cause. That is very different from saying that everything whatsoever has a cause. Secondly, the argument is by no means arbitrary in claiming that God does not have a cause of his own. For the reason other things require a cause is precisely because they have potentialities that need to be actualized. By contrast, what is purely actual has no potentialities, and so there's nothing in it that needs to be, or indeed could be, actualized. Naturally, then, it is the one thing that need not have a cause of its own. Still, the critic may insist, following the empiricist philosopher David Hume, that in theory, even coffee cups, stones, and the like might exist without a cause. I've said that any potentiality that is actualized must be actualized by something already actual. But didn't Hume show that it's at least conceivable that something could pop into existence uncaused? And in that case, couldn't something go from potential to actual without being caused to do so by something already actual? But in fact, Hume showed no such thing. What Hume had in mind was the sort of case where we imagine an empty space in which something suddenly appears, a stone, a coffee cup, or whatever. Of course, that is imaginable. But that's hardly the same thing as conceiving of the stone or coffee cup coming into being without a cause. At the very most, it is conceiving of it without at the same time conceiving of its cause. And that is completely unremarkable. I can conceive of something being a trilateral, that is to say, a closed plane figure with 3 straight sides, without at the same time thinking of it as a triangle. But it doesn't follow that any trilateral could ever exist in reality without being at the same time a triangle. To conceive of A without at the same time conceiving of B is not the same thing as conceiving of A existing without B. By the same token, if I can conceive of a stone or a coffee cup suddenly appearing without at the same time conceiving of its cause, it doesn't follow that I've conceived of it as having no cause. And it doesn't follow that it could exist in reality without a cause. It's just a non sequitur. For another thing, and as the philosopher Elizabeth Anscombe pointed out, for Hume to make his case, he has to tell us why a coffee cup suddenly appearing in a previously empty space counts as an instance of coming into existence in the first place, whether with a cause or otherwise. For why shouldn't we suppose instead that the cup has merely been transported from somewhere else? So, Hume would need to add something to his scenario in order to distinguish the cup's coming into existence from its merely being transported. But now Hume has a problem. For the only way to distinguish a cup's coming into existence from its being transported is by reference to the causes of these different sorts of event. A cup's coming into existence involves one sort of cause, molding a bit of porcelain or plastic, say, while a cup's being transported involves another sort of cause. Someone's picking it up and moving it, say. Hume's scenario was supposed to eliminate the notion of a cause, but to spell it out in the detail that he needs ends up bringing back in the notion of a cause. Now, an alternative criticism might look to Immanuel Kant rather than to David Hume, another famous critic of this sort of argument for God's existence. We learn that things have causes from our observation of the empirical world. The surrounding air cools down the coffee, the air conditioner cools the air, you turn on the air conditioner, and so forth. But even if we acknowledge that the principle of causality applies to within the world of our experience, why should we suppose that we can extend it beyond the empirical world to a purely actual actualizer of things, to something which, because it is immaterial, outside of time and space, etc., is unobservable? But this objection is not difficult to answer. It's true that we learn the principle of causality from our experience of the world, but it doesn't follow that we cannot apply it beyond the world of experience. For the reason that we conclude that the things of our experience require causes is not because we experience them, but rather because they are merely potential until made actual. And the principle that no potential can actualize itself is completely general. Once we learn it, we can apply it beyond the things we've actually experienced. And there's no reason to doubt that we can apply it as well beyond what we could experience. Compare. We learn Euclidean geometry by looking at drawings of various geometrical figures, usually in black ink. But what we learn applies to geometrical figures of any color, and indeed of no color at all. To think that the principle of causality applies only to things that we can experience is like thinking that Euclidean geometry applies only to figures that we can see. But now the critic might appeal to science instead of philosophy. For doesn't quantum mechanics give us reason to think that an event could occur without a cause? For example, quantum physics gives us a statistical description of the electron's transition between energy levels in a hydrogen atom. It tells us the probability that the electron will be at this level or that. But it doesn't identify any trigger for the transition. Doesn't this show that the transition occurs without a cause? The answer is that it shows no such thing. One problem with this sort of objection is that it is often framed in a way that presupposes that any cause has to be a deterministic one, so that the statistical nature of quantum mechanics, in ruling out determinism, thereby rules out causality. But there's no reason at all to think that what actualizes a potential must do so in a rigidly deterministic way. That is merely to mistake one kind of causality for causality as such. But there's a deeper problem with the objection at hand. From the premise that, premise one, quantum mechanics describes the transition of the electron without making reference to a cause, unquote, it simply doesn't follow that, two, quantum mechanics shows that the transition of the electron has no cause. That's just a non sequitur. Such an inference would be no better than reasoning from the premise that Kepler's laws describe the orbits of the planets without making reference to any cause of those orbits, to the conclusion that Kepler's laws therefore show that the orbits of the planets have no cause. Of course, the motions of the planets do have a cause, namely gravitation. That Kepler's laws make no reference to that cause doesn't entail that it isn't there. Similarly, that quantum mechanics doesn't make reference to the cause of the electron's transition doesn't entail that there isn't one. But doesn't quantum mechanics give us a complete description of the physical phenomena it describes in a way that Kepler's laws do not? In particular, if something doesn't appear in the description of the micro level of physical reality that quantum mechanics provides, isn't that a reason to think that it doesn't exist? The answer, once again, is in the negative, and the reason has to do with the nature of physics. Physics aims at capturing those aspects of nature susceptible of strict prediction and control. For that reason, it quite deliberately abstracts from every aspect of the physical world that cannot be described in mathematical terms. But for the same reason, it cannot possibly offer an exhaustive description of physical reality. As Bertrand Russell, who was, needless to say, no friend of arguments for God's existence, once wrote, quote, quoting from Russell's book, My Philosophical Development, "It is not always realized," Russell says, "how exceedingly abstract is the information that theoretical physics has to give. It lays down certain fundamental equations which enable it to deal with the logical structure of events, while leaving it completely unknown what is the intrinsic character of the events that have that structure. We only know the intrinsic character of events as they happen to us, when they happen to us. Nothing whatever in theoretical physics enables us to say anything about the intrinsic character of events elsewhere. They may be just like the events that happen to us, or they may be totally different in strictly unimaginable ways. All that physics gives us is certain equations giving abstract properties of their changes. But as to what it is that changes, and what it changes from and to, as to this, physics is silent," unquote. To think that physics gives us a complete description of the physical world is a little like thinking that when an aircraft engineer determines the average weight of airline passengers, he's therefore given us an exhaustive description of airline passengers. In both cases, what we have is an abstract model which captures, for certain narrow purposes, an aspect of the reality described, and not the whole of it. There's another consideration. The objection in question appeals to the laws that govern the systems described by quantum mechanics in its attempt to undermine the principle of causality. But for a system to follow laws is just for it to be the kind of thing that behaves in accordance with those laws. That is to say, talk of laws, laws of physics, laws of nature more generally, is really just a kind of shorthand for a description of the way a thing will tend to operate given its nature. That is to say, given the form or pattern that it possesses, which distinguishes it from other kinds of thing, to make use of some terminology that I introduced earlier. But what makes it the case in the first place that a given system, including the universe as a whole, if that's how we want to characterize the system in question, has a form or nature of the sort underlying the behavior described by quantum mechanics, as opposed to some other form? Why does a world governed by quantum mechanics specifically exist instead of some other world? Once again, we have a question about what actualizes a potential. And notice that it would be no good to appeal to the laws of quantum mechanics in answering that question on pain of vicious circularity. It is no good to say that given the laws of quantum mechanics, something might happen without a cause, because what we are now asking about is what accounts for the operation of the laws in the first place. An explanation of the laws of quantum mechanics cannot coherently appeal to the laws of quantum mechanics. One last point before I close here. A similar problem afflicts another science-based objection to the sort of argument I've been defending. It is sometimes suggested that Newton's law of inertia, according to which a body in motion will remain in motion unless acted upon by outside forces, shows that change could occur without a cause. Now, there's a lot that could be said in response to this objection. I've said a lot about it elsewhere. But for present purposes, the following points will suffice. Excuse me. First of all, what Newton's law describes are events ordered in time. For example, the motion of molecules as coffee swirls around in a cup. But as I've emphasized, the argument for the existence of God that we've been examining is ultimately concerned with the question of what actualizes a thing's potential to exist at any particular moment of time. It is concerned, for example, with what makes it the case at any moment why the components of a water molecule actually constitute a water molecule specifically in the first place rather than some other kind of thing. Since Newton's law presupposes the existence of things like water molecules, it can hardly explain their existence. Furthermore, like the laws of quantum mechanics, Newton's law is simply a shorthand description for the way a thing will behave given the nature or form or pattern that it exhibits. But what makes it the case that there actually are things that have that sort of nature or form rather than another in the first place? What actualizes that potential? Newtonian mechanics can no more answer that sort of question than can quantum mechanics. It makes no sense to appeal to Newton's laws in order to explain why things that follow Newton's laws exist in the first place. All right, lots of other objections that could be considered, but I'll end with that one. And maybe we can address some of the other ones in the Q&A session. But I thank you anyway for your attention. Oh, yeah.